Yes, everyone, you know what time it is. It's your boy Jack here at the Irish Hotspur, and we're going to be delivering you that MANOR Solomon Scout report. Been trying to do it as quickly as I can here. And of course, we've been given the here we go from Fabrizio Romano. We've been given, I think, some news that it could be a 4-year contract, of course, a free transfer. He's been signed on a free deal as well. And MANOR Solomon is probably a guy that you're thinking I might be sort of BSing, might be sort of kind of bluffing a bit here, but it's actually luckily not the case this time. It's because I happen to be a bit of a fan of Shakhtar Donetsk and what they've been able to do over the years in Europe because I do feel like they're a team that punch above their weight. Now, Shakhtar are a team I really have actually kind of admired from a distance and sort of rooted for whenever Spurs are maybe knocked out of the European leagues, or they're just sort of the other team that I like to sort of have on. And they seem to always be able to produce elite talent all over the world, including in their own country, I believe, as well. And they play, I think, usually that sort of exciting brand of football, especially usually a very high possession kind of brand of football that a lot of us Spurs fans, I think, would enjoy. And what I think really what's impressive as well is that they try to do it, or at least they attempt it on the bigger stages against bigger opponents, much better opponents, if you will, with, much more experienced players as well as more talented players. And I think it's just something that's quite admirable about them. What I do enjoy about Shakhtar Donetsk is, like I said, they sort of instill a very, technical brand of football that's very pleasing to watch, but they're sort of able to do it to whoever, comes through their academy across the world. It's, I think, not just focused on Ukrainian players. Now, to prove my point even further about how I think actually they do produce kind of very technically sound players sort of on a consistent basis, just look at their most recent Champions League campaign where they punched again well above their weight, and they didn't have nearly as many international players to pick from, like a Solomon, like a Tete, like a Marcus Antonio. They had to get rid of a lot of their best, most talented, sort of experienced international players that weren't from Ukraine. And they came up against not an easy group, but you would say it was actually one of the more difficult groups. They had Celtic, Ange Postecoglou, Celtic, in fact, RB Leipzig, as well as Real Madrid. And they got a very convincing 6 points out of it, whereas Celtic actually finished beneath them. And what I think was impressive about that Shakhtar team was, like, again, it was probably one of the lesser talented, lesser experienced sort of teams I'd ever seen them field in sort of the European stages like that, especially on a really high stage like the Champions League and the group qualifying. And to be able to get that convincing 6 points, despite probably having, I would think, the least talented, maybe the least experienced team out of all the Champions League sort of teams that we were able to watch last season, to get those 6 points, I think was very impressive. But if you even watched them at all, you could see how actually technically sound the majority of their players were, and they were still trying to play a very expansive, very attractive brand of football. They weren't trying to always sort of sit back and sit deep and trying to counter teams. They were able to try to pass it amongst themselves and try to break teams down, despite, again, not having nearly as good players as, what you usually would face in a Champions League setting. Now, to convince you more to sort of give Shakhtar Donetsk sort of products a chance, here's kind of a big list of players that I think some of them have been kind of misses or maybe haven't exactly proven themselves, but others have also been, sort of big hits. And I'm not going to just sort of list only hits. I think I got to be fair, but let's look at this sort of extensive list of players that they've produced only really quite recently, I think, from their academy, or if, at least from their team over, maybe a few years of them developing at the club. You have Timashuk, who I think was a Bayern and sort of Zenit legend. Dodo, who played in that Conference League final for Fiorentina. Douglas Costa, who is a really fun player to watch for Bayern and Juventus. Marcus Antonio, who's just gone to Lazio in the Serie A. You have Fernandinho, who's basically a Man City legend. Willian, who was really proven player in the Premier League for the likes of Chelsea and for, I think, Fulham. I think he's had a great season there. Fred, I think he's been more of a miss, so you could say he's actually been more of a dud. Henrik Mkhitaryan, I think, has proved himself as a classy player no matter what league he's been. You have Fernando, who I think is a big up-and-coming player. He's actually in RB Salzburg over in Austria, and maybe he'll make a big move to a top-5 league. And then you also have Tete, who's kind of an alternative to Manor Solomon and also sort of around the same age, who I think is also still a very talented product to have come out of there. And then, of course, I'm maybe missing out some players like Mudryk, big recent example, as well as Bernard, who I think went over to Everton. But of course, at the end of the day, I think you have to sort of look at the fact that Shakhtar sort of produced a very technically sound player. And if maybe they didn't make it in Europe, they still always seem to, at least on the eye, at least sort of with the seeing eye test, produce players that I would maybe regard as maybe more technically sound than anything. And that's what they've been able to do on a consistent basis. And the reason we're not really going into the stats yet is because I feel like he has a long and extensive injury list. And so we don't really have a very big sample size. For kind of a recent example of Fulham, he had a really big injury in the very beginning of the season, where I think it was against Liverpool, and then he didn't come back until January or something like that. And then also, I think over at Shakhtar, he had a bunch of injuries here and there that I think probably would have contributed to the fact that he didn't have as many minutes or as many starts as you would kind of think a guy that, is as talented as him or is supposed to be as talented as him at Shakhtar Donetsk or even at Fulham. And so it's something kind of worth noting again when it comes to that sample size and when it comes to sort of maybe why we're not going to be diving too much into the stats. And we're actually going to be diving maybe more into sort of kind of Solomon's story, as well as what I've kind of just been able to see with my own eyes when I've actually been watching him. And despite not too many goals, he's actually scored against top quality opponents with 2 goals against Real Madrid, one against Atalanta, all those being match winning goals, actually, by the way. And he also had an equalizer in a 1-1 draw against Man City in a group stage match. He also scored in their impressive run to a Europa League semifinal, also at only the age of 20 years old, too. So I think that shows that he was able to, from a very young age, even as an impact sort of sub, he was able to actually grab some pretty important goals against some pretty big opponents, which, really kind of makes me excited about him and kind of what made me sort of aware of him in the first place is that, again, I don't watch the Ukrainian Premier League, but I do watch Shakhtar Donetsk when they do play in the occasional Europa League or Conference League or even Champions League matches. And back in the days of sort of 2019, 2020, 2021, Solomon was kind of popping up with these big goals here and there for them. And so that's what sort of kind of made me sort of aware of him in the first place. And in that Europa League run where they went to a semifinal actually in 2020, Shakhtar Donetsk were led by Luis Castro, who played kind of a 4-2-3-1, 4-3-3 system that was, again, sort of very possession heavy, very possession reliant, and very sort of possession focused. And maybe some managers here and there are sort of less sort of, strict on that sort of thing when it comes to Shakhtar. But like I said before, I think they're very consistent about using very highly technical, skilled players. And they do usually play sort of a very high possession type of brand of football. And they still try to play it against better opponents. And I think what's interesting too is that this was probably one of the teams that maybe Solomon, I guess, sort of thrived the most in, despite maybe sort of in that Europa League run being used more as an impact sub. He still scored, like I said, some very important goals. And he would come on more as a dynamic sort of kind of winger, either for Marlos, who played sort of kind of like an inside right wing kind of position, or he would play kind of maybe on the left where Tyson is sort of a very famous or sort of at least kind of for Shakhtar Donetsk, I think a guy that was always there, kind of a very experienced winger for them. He also actually got to play under De Zerbi, if you didn't know, but he seemed to get sort of fewer minutes. I think, at least in the Ukrainian Premier League, I think he got a plenty of minutes for De Zerbi in the Champions League, but I think in the Ukrainian Premier League, he seemed to get fewer minutes. I think for probably injury reasons, if I'm not mistaken, but also it could be because a guy like Mikhailo Mudryk was actually coming through the academy, and that was somebody that obviously De Zerbi, I believe, really trusted in. Let's take a look at some of the stats from Honor Solomon. Now, I'm not going to use his stats from his Fulham season. I think it's too small of a sample size as well. I think he had that huge injury in the beginning of the season that ruled him out till January. And as well, he was only able to grab around 600 minutes played. So, not really too much of a good sample size for me to work with. I think that would be unfair, I think, to you guys as well as to the player. But let's maybe sort of do something a bit unorthodox. We're going to combine some of his seasons that he's been able to register in the Champions League. And for such a young guy, he actually has plenty of experience in the Champions League. He has a total of 11 matches played and 8 starts in the Champions League. So I believe that's actually even more minutes than what he was able to register for Fulham. So I've decided to sort of combine some stats here from his 2020-21 season in the Champions League and his 21-22 season. And when you look at sort of, 2 seasons in a row, you want to maybe look for consistency, right? And that's what I've decided to sort of pick out here, as well as also pick out some stats that maybe were a bit of a concern. All of these, I think, are fair reflection of what you're sort of looking for from a winger, especially from these wide areas. And what I think Manor Solomon really excels in is taking on his man. He's probably actually one of the more talented players, I think, in his age group, probably around Europe when it comes to it. He was able to, I think, in his 2020-21 season, grab at least 3.89 successful take-ons. So that's at least 3 guys that he's getting past per 90. And that put him in the top percentile of any midfielder in the Champions League that season. And the following season under De Zerbi, he was grabbing 2.52. So again, that put him in the top 10 percentile of any midfielder in the Champions League. He had also plenty of take-ons attempted. He was attempting nearly 5 per match when in that 2020-21 season under Luis Castro. And when you're attempting nearly 5 a match, that's like near Matoma, Alan St. Maximin type levels of, trying to be aggressive and taking your man on. And he's also really good at sort of carrying it into the penalty area and being aggressive again, sort of on the ball and carrying the ball. And sort of kind of that Luis Castro season, he's in the top 25%. And then in the De Zerbi season, he's in the top 1% of any midfielder in terms of carrying the ball into the penalty area per match. Now, when you're looking sort of at creative numbers for like creating for others, it's a bit more confusing. And a stat that we always sort of look at is actually key passes. It's sort of when you're, measuring basically, a pass that leads directly to a shot on goal, probably a pretty important one. And I think what's kind of a bit weird is that despite being very good at taking it past his man and being very consistent at taking it past his man, at least when it comes to the stats, he's actually not been too great at sort of registering those key passes. He was in the third percentile, which means he's in the very, very bottom of any midfielder. He was actually registering zero in that Luis Castro season. And then in the De Zerbi season, the following season, he was in the top 2 percentile. So I feel like that's when we sort of have a small sample size, different managers, and things can maybe get a bit confusing there and we can't really draw too many conclusions. But you look at shot creating actions, which is again sort of a very good measurement of sort of creating for others as well as just creating for the team in general. He really was only in the bottom percentile again under Luis Castro, but under De Zerbi, he was in the top 8 percentile of any midfielder in the Champions League. So just sort of, numbers that we want to sort of point out there just to not make him look like, he's the best player ever or anything like that. And also as well, just to sort of show that maybe under different managers, he's been able to get different types of creative numbers. Now, if I were to do a summary of sort of things that I've seen with my own seeing eye, just from those Champions League and Europa League games with Manor Solomon, I think he has really good close control. It's probably one of his best attributes. And he's not exactly a guy that sort of is always going to be knocking it past you, right? With, and beating you for pace. He's kind of more like, if anything, it's a very complimentary sort of comparison, but maybe more like an Eden Hazard, like a guy that has that really good close control and just sort of takes it past his man that way. Not like maybe a Leao or an Mbappe who's sort of just gonna, have really good close control initially, but then he's gonna just sort of take it, and burst it right past you. He's really good though, still at carrying up the pitch, despite maybe not being, like I said, the fastest sort of at, driving it up. He's still very, good on the acceleration, very good agility, and can carry it up the pitch quite quickly still. And that's probably one of his best attributes. We looked at the progressive carries from earlier just to prove that. He's shown that he can be a huge impact sub, which I think is very important. He's scored against obviously Real Madrid off the bench. He scored against the likes of Atalanta off the bench to get a huge equalizer for them. He scored in some massive games for Shakhtar, mostly I believe off the bench as well. And so that's something that shows that if he were coming off the bench for a Sonny or someone else, maybe that's a winger in the creative positions, he's not going to, sort of, take his time, to get into the game. He could actually make an impact quite quickly. He's a very good finisher from what we've seen. I think everybody sort of has only seen those finishes from Fulham, but if you look at some of those goals that, like I said, he scored in those massive games for Shakhtar in Europe, he's been able to score kind of a variety of goals. If I were to point out any weaknesses, I mean, it's unfair. He's born with what he's got, but he is a bit small. Like I said, if I were to make that comparison to a player kind of like Eden Hazard in the way that he carries the ball, but those guys can often actually not be bullied as much because they have that low center of gravity and they often are kind of hard to bully for that reason. So it's just something maybe to point out that he's not exactly the strongest player. Injuries, it looks like he has picked up an injury almost every season. I think since joining Shakhtar, and even picked up a big injury for Fulham as well. So it's just something to look at. And we don't exactly have the most confident medical department. He does seem to go missing. I think of course, we tried to make him look like a very good player in the scout report. I've seen maybe more of him than others have, but I feel like at times I've also seen him go missing in games, and that's something to maybe point out there as well. Maybe another weakness to point out, if I were to sort of stretch or maybe exaggerate, is that maybe he's not the greatest at sort of creating for others with that sort of killer pass like a James Madison can. He's very good at creating for others with taking it past his man and being very positive that way. But I haven't always seen him play sort of a beautiful through ball and behind the players. But I could be totally wrong because sort of the sample size that I'm working with from what I've seen with my own two eyes is more to just kind of the random Champions League and Europa League games that I've been able to catch him in. And oftentimes that's actually coming off the bench. Now, this could be a long one. I apologize. I probably explained a lot on his background, and I'm sure you're sick of me by now and just want kind of a real opinion on this. And I'll give it to you. This is a great signing, and I do approve of this signing. We needed a replacement for Danjuma, and for Lucas that could actually fit this Ange Postecoglou high possession system. And this is the guy that I feel like has the attributes to do it. He's very good at taking on his man, and his development over at Shakhtar Donetsk, I think, has actually prepared him for this Ange Postecoglou system and these Ange Postecoglou tactics. This was a position that I feel like did need addressing. It's not exactly the position that we've always been talking about, really, that needs addressing, but we did need to find replacements for Lucas and for Danjuma who offer that challenge as well as that rotation option to the likes of Sonny. If I were to guess, he could be Sonny's heir or sort of the guy that's going to try to make the impossible attempt to fill Sonny's shoes. But I feel like Solomon at the end of the day is a guy that's going to fit the system quite well. He's going to fit it quite seamlessly. And I don't know if there's going to be a ton of pressure on him to be the guy that's going to be starting match day one. In fact, I probably think he's going to be starting on the bench match day one. And he's going to be used as that young rotation option that can develop into one day the guy that might have to take on the impossible task of taking over for Sonny in that left wing. Now, this is a position or a role that was never going to be a star signing, so I don't think we could have expected some big name player to come in here. But at the end of the day, I think Solomon's actually on a free transfer, a very good player and a very talented player for a free transfer. And I imagine Spurs will probably be seeing Shakhtar Donetsk very soon in court. But everybody, give me your thoughts on MANOR Solomon. Let me know if there's anything I might have missed on the guy that is probably worth mentioning that I'll mention next time. Also, as well, let me know if you're a big fan of MANOR Solomon. Let me know if you're a big skeptic of MANOR Solomon. Let me know why you think this transfer is probably not the right one, or maybe just a guy that's unproven. Give me every reason why you think MANOR Solomon's going to be a great signing, or if you're actually a bit skeptical about this signing in the comments down below. Feel free as well to hit that like button. Feel free to grab a membership to support all the various content that we put out for you guys. But I will be seeing ya. Come on, you Spurs. And in the big Ange I trust. And welcome to Tottenham Hotspur, MANOR Solomon.